Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, and to me, reading over this passage, especially on the heels of chapter 4, it seems like Paul is doing everything he can to kind of teach Timothy how to be a good leader in chapter 4, and now he's pivoting to what kinds of things he should lead and what kinds of just actual decisions he should make when it comes to managing a church and caring for people, and it's interesting what he chooses to highlight here.
I think there's a lot that talks about honor in this chapter as well. It seems like there's a lot right at the beginning that even talks about how to address or speak to people who are older or younger than you. Then it also goes into widows and how to honor them and their families well. So I think it's, well, and even that towards the end it talks about elders and how to honor them well. So I think this whole chapter really just has to do with thinking about like the age of individuals that you interact with and how to go about doing it in a way that is honoring to the Lord, but honoring to them as well.
So there's a couple like clear groups mentioned in this passage. I would say it's specifically calling out widows. There's quite a bit of instruction for caring for widows, which is like a critical piece of our faith, that we care well for widows and orphans. That's consistent across the Old and New Testament. Also, there's clear call outs to caring for elders. And I think we could actually take that to be like elders of the church. I think that is clear in this chapter. But I also think that there's like a clear call out for just older generations in the church, how to care for them. And that's actually how the chapter starts out. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, all in purity. It's really interesting to me how 1 Timothy 5 has this intergenerational feel, in that Timothy is being prepared to do this ministry. Paul has already told him to not let people look down on him because he's young, but now he's telling them, hey, there is high honor for people who are older than you, and in the same way that you shouldn't let people look down on you because you're young, you should not look down on other people because they're old. And I actually think that this could be a really timely reminder that church historically has always been like a vibrant intergenerational community where older people are regularly interacting with younger people, and there's clear commands for older people, and there's also clear commands for younger people. One thing that makes me sort of sad running in larger church circles is sometimes churches can get so siloed where you're trying to figure out a program for every kind of age group that interaction between generations kind of melts away, and we lose it unintentionally. And I don't think that's a great thing.
I think this is really pointing out, though, the importance for Timothy as he is going to be leading and interacting with older and younger people. Because I know even for us, as we had considered full-time like senior level pastoral ministry just in the past, it's always been a thought to me, like, how in the world do we as a pastoral couple lead people who could be our grandparents? And I think it's really important here because it does say, our study Bible mentions that like correction is not prohibited, but it is meant to be done with respect.
Wisdom, compassion, respect.
Right. Yeah. Because, I mean, even as an older woman someday, I'm sure 1,000% I will definitely do dumb things. And I hope that there are people who are in my life spiritually leading me that will correct me in ways that are respectful to me and not belittling or like, I know more than you. I actually heard of an instance recently of a pastor who had approached someone who unfortunately kind of just like flaunted their degrees and didn't necessarily help the person who was on the other end of the conversation, who was older than them, who had just things that they're sorting through. But rather than, I guess, approaching the conversation respectfully, it turned into like I'm smarter than you because I have XYZ or just whatever. So I've heard it going both ways, but I think this is really calling out to Timothy, like, you have authority as a leader, but make sure you use it wisely.
And I think it's good that you're highlighting it's not wrong to correct people. When somebody's wrong, you correct them, but always with wisdom and respect, because consistently the church is viewed as this committed body of believers that are caring for each other. And I think it's common as we become more segmented and more cautious of each other, that we lose some of that.
Well, I think too, like we've gone to like family reunions, right? I'm sure everybody has gone to some kind of family gathering where there is like, when you speak to the adults in the room, there is like this level of authority of who they are. And it's not bad to like question and like try to gain wisdom or learn from them. But you also like, you don't disrespect in how you speak to them. Like I know we've gone to plenty of like reunions with your side of the family,
They
Ryan.
like it. The Mennonites like reunions.
But I know that you've even just talked to your grandfather, and there are things about faith that he has for sure instilled on your family. But there are also questions that you just kind of like ask sometimes too, to just be like, well, what do you think about this? And it actually causes older generations to think, not that they're dumb or whatever, but it does cause them to think in a different way that is respectful and actually productive for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting as we have, there's a lot of studies on how we've gone from a high honor culture to a low honor culture. And high honor cultures are places that really, really value the elders and have things in place to make sure that respect for the elders is critical and always present. So a lot of, obviously I've never been to Japan, but a lot of times people talk about Japan as a high honor culture. I would say when we spend time in Juarez, even in Juarez in Mexico, that high honor is a little bit more visible. Because actually the older folks lament how American influence on Mexican culture is causing the young people to be less respectful of elders. But it is interesting that Christianity is kind of birthed out of and encouraged to be this high honor culture where we have respect for older people who have gone through more things and have wisdom in more things. But in the recent past, we've kind of pivoted to being a youth-focused culture to where at times, like I've actually been in meetings with churches where it's like, oh, these old people, like we can't just do what they say. They're just always demanding what they want. And you end up accidentally like repeating the same mistakes that they've seen repeated before because you refuse to respect the wisdom that they have. And obviously that doesn't mean that once you're, older than 60 or 70 or something, you're just right all the time and we should listen to everything you say. But there is kind of this holistic idea of younger people relating to older people investing in younger people that is critical to the church. And I would encourage you, like, if you don't see that in your church, try to figure out ways to bring some of that because it is really valuable. I mean, we're in our late 30s. I'm all for hearing from people. Okay, you're in your mid 30s, I suppose.
I was going to say, I'm not even to mid yet. Thank you very much.
I'm all for hearing from people that have done life a lot longer than I have because oftentimes they are thinking through things that I am not. And oftentimes they are very good at correcting me kindly, but correctly. And I have so many stories of times in church leadership where I thought an older person was coming to pat me on the back and they were actually coming to like gently correct me. And at first it's kind of odd and you're like, man, I don't know if they should be telling me what to do. But with a little bit of time and experience, it's like, man, I'm so happy that they told me that. So anyway, all that to say, and we haven't even dug into the meat here, all that to say, the church really is meant to be intergenerational. There's all kinds of studies on how beneficial that is. But it's clear here that Paul has that in mind when he's teaching Timothy because he wants Timothy to deal with every generation and every person with respect, with concern, with care and compassion, ultimately striving to honor Christ as we glorify him together as one unified body.
Well, I was going to move on.
Yeah, move on. Okay. Go for
it. So they do spend significant time discussing widows. And I think there's something interesting. Again, we're talking about like younger and older widows. Yep. So it does say honor widows who are truly widows. And I don't know. Perhaps that could use a little
Strikes you as like a little bit weird, right?
Yeah. I think what this is actually referring to is if a widow actually had no one to take care of her. It does say that in verse 4, if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them learn how to show godliness to their own household. So they're like, and says, and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God. Continues supplications, prayers day and night. So I think there is a difference here. It's like if there is no one for them, it's like make sure you take care of them. If they have people in their lives, let them try to help first. It's like very much this family scenario again. Like allow families to take care of each other before we like jump right in and I guess almost take away from the opportunity for families to flourish.
Well, a key word here in 1 Timothy 5 is enrolled, and I think it's used twice. I have it circled once, but I think I heard it twice. If you look at verse 9, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband and having a reputation for good works. And he goes on. The enrolled word there, like this is actually an instruction for Timothy on who to allow into like the church food program. So they're being enrolled into an actual care program that was managed and planned. That is the food program that's mentioned in the early part of Acts, where they actually choose men. It's Acts 6, where they choose spirit-filled, godly men to care for the food distribution. This is like an early picture of what this food program looks like, and that is what Paul's referring to here. And the heart of it is essentially like, hey, we are definitely going to care for people that need to be cared for, but we need to make sure we're caring for the right people, because we don't want to fall into a situation where there's a high level of idleness and busybodiness, which he also references, that would have been common, I think, in the church in Thessalonica, which we just read about in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, where they almost got lazy and it was a super negative thing. So Paul here is encouraging Timothy just to wisely care for this food program and make sure that the benefits are handed out to people that actually need them, people that did not have the kinds of things they needed available to them. And you can also see that Paul's he's cautioning him to hand out things to people who can like make their own means and care for themselves and come from families that can care for themselves. And
mostly because to not take away from the ones who truly need.
Yeah, not to put more pressure on the church than is necessary, not to create some kind of program where you're just caring for people that don't actually need help, because that unfairly taxes everyone. And I mean, it's not actually a formal tax, but unfairly expects people to be caring for people that could be caring for themselves. And a key passage here is verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And depending on your family situation, that could be particularly stinging. But essentially what Paul's saying is like, hey, if you're a believer, if you're a follower of Christ, you do need to take care of your family. Mm-hmm. And in this context, he's actually referring to older people in your family. And so it might seem like kind of an old school, old fashioned notion that you need to be prepared to care for your aging parents, but it's a very biblical notion. And actually Jesus himself uses that. I think it's in Mark when he's confronting the Pharisees about how they spend their money. So it's very biblical to try to care for people in your family first and foremost, and then people for the church after that.
So then I guess we can just kind of end it here. It does talk a little bit about masters and elders as we enter into the end of this chapter. I guess masters is more next chapter, I guess, mm-hmm, but it does lead into that as we read into chapter 6. But elders specifically is interesting. I'm wondering if it's because it's still regarding that that age bit, because I typically think of elders as like being older, wiser people in the faith anyway. That
was already established. So he established that if you're an elder overseer in the church, you are older, wiser in the faith.
Right.
You're more spiritually
mature. So I
mature.
guess that's kind of like drawing back to the whole respectfully.
I believe so. And if you look at verse 17, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. That's directly connected to what he laid down in 1 Timothy 3. And the double honor piece, again, is like it's not just talking about honor. It's actually talking about compensation. So he's saying like, hey, it's okay to financially care for these guys that are putting a lot of hard work into preaching, especially preaching and teaching, because you don't muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. So he is actually saying like, don't be afraid to financially care for these leaders in your churches, which today is why we say pastors can be paid. They don't have to be paid, but it's certainly not wrong to do so. And you see from Paul's ministry that in some churches he was financially supported, and in other churches he worked really hard to set an example of working to support yourself. So Paul does both, but here he's reminding Timothy that, hey, it's okay to care for those guys and make sure they have what they need so that we can continue the work of the gospel.
Yep. I do think something that is interesting too, like this role was not taken lightly.
Right.
So like elders were chosen, selected, and used in the church body, not like this willy-nilly thing. So I noticed when it said about in verse 19, admitting a charge against an elder, don't do it without the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So like it's a very big deal to call out someone, which I think it is necessary. I feel like I wondered today, because it's when I heard that, it was like, oh, 2 or 3 people have to be around. But like, I also wondered too, maybe that makes me uncomfortable because we're not as picky and I guess
as honoring.
Well, I meant in choosing our elders and leaders.
Yeah.
So anyway.
I mean, he's making a clear point that if you are an elder, you're in a high position. You need to strive to be spiritually mature. But at the same time, if you are an elder who is supposed to be spiritually mature and you are doing something sinful, you should be confronted publicly in front of everybody so that you don't bring dishonor on the body. So again, elders have a high expectation, and if they fail to meet that expectation, they should be held accountable for it. And you see that reflected here, but also you see in his language, like, this is not something to take lightly. Make sure that you're giving people the benefit of the doubt, essentially. Obviously he doesn't say exactly those words. But you can see the spirit of him trying to care for leadership, care for the church, care for different generations. I think this is a good chapter to read and to look at how we can do this better, because I think there's just opportunities all over the place for how we can do this intergenerational bit a little bit better than what we are.
Just a tagline quick. I think that was a good year part. I think we can probably end with it, but just for fun, if you want to read verse 23, it is kind of just random. Our Bible does say it's like a strange little spew in there. Verse 23, no longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. Our study Bible says it's not totally clear why they use that. So if you're hearing the reading and you're like, why didn't they talk about that?
Yeah.
It's just a weird little
We
verse.
could do a whole thing on
chuckle.
that. I guess we're trying not to do a whole deep dive on that. It's most likely that's rooted in Paul's personal awareness of Timothy. Probably Timothy dealt with some sicknesses and some ailments. This is Paul saying, hey, take a little bit of wine. It'll help you with your sickness, which is true. And it's also very hard to make the case that Christians should be against alcohol when Paul is saying, like, hey, drink a little bit of wine for yourself. Certainly we are against becoming drunk, but we're not against alcohol. However, you could easily make the case that if we're against being drunk, then just don't drink at all, and then you'll never be drunk. And there are also people who have done plenty of studies on what alcohol was like then versus what alcohol is like now. Alcohol then was much more watered down, way less potent, and they actually did not even have distilled types of alcohol like we have, like whiskeys and that kind of stuff. So anyway, all that to say, you were trying not to jump into it. But it's worth noting, because I grew up in a culture that was like, alcohol is a sin. Alcohol is not a sin. Misuse of alcohol most certainly is a sin, and it is worth just avoiding it altogether to avoid sin altogether. But if you drink a beer, you're not dishonoring God, I don't think. If you disagree with me, we have a link in the description that you can send me a message. I'll be happy to engage with you and hear from you and all those things. But we are getting over time, I think, because Jenny just brought up that wine verse and had me jump into it.
Hey,
but
I was ready to do 2 seconds on it. You took it for another minute or 2.
I'll make it clear that drinking a little bit of wine for your stomach is not the your part. The your part is to honor in an intergenerational way. And I think even beyond that, try to find somebody who's a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and ask them to help you grow in your own faith. You will certainly benefit from it. So we'll be back again tomorrow, rounding out 1 Timothy, finishing up with 1 Timothy chapter 6. We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us, as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
1 Timothy chapter 5. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, and to make some return for their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God, and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation of good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already stayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain," and the laborer deserves his wages. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. As for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear. In the presence of God and of Jesus Christ and of the elect angels, I charge you to keep these rules without prejudging, doing nothing from partiality. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, nor take part in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and for frequent ailments. The sins of some people are conspicuous, going after them to judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, and even those that are not cannot remain hidden. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.